Okay, the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy put out this article that I chose to summarize, Supporting Students with Dyslexia at the Secondary Level, an Emotional Model of Literacy. Sorry, my dog is taking a very long drink in the background. Okay, she's done. So the main discussion that I found from this article was the contrast between the idea of a very mechanical approach to dyslexia versus a holistic approach to working with students with dyslexia. This quote, the article started stating that many teachers continue. Pause. Okay, the article started by comparing these two ideas, presenting the idea that many teachers have pedagogical models that are essentially mechanistic when working with students with dyslexia. So the idea that a lot of teachers approach working with students who have learning difficulties or disabilities in a very mechanical manner. There's not a lot of attention paid towards the students' holistic well-being, their social-emotional skills, how they're doing emotionally in the classroom. So the article starts by talking about how Northern Ireland and several other places have recently recognized dyslexia as a learning difficulty or a disability, and then it jumps into a case study with a young boy named Matthew who gets tested for dyslexia and as a result has a lot of accommodations put in place for him. There's a case study about teacher and student relationships on teacher empathy, how empathetic students perceive their teachers to be. And this is where I was really hooked on the ideas in the article because it discussed shame and its impact in a classroom environment. And I thought of all these examples that I have heard just, at the end of the semester when we're tired, but this article is a good reminder that words have a large impact. These quotes, she should be able to do this by now. Well, eventually I'm not going to hold his hand anymore, or in the real world, you're just expected to read, so why should it be any different in my classroom? Those are all things that I've heard other teachers say. Those are things that I actively avoid trying to say about my students. It's really, shame in this article was a huge focus. They talked about how students who have a long history of learning difficulties or learning disabilities have compiled this identity within themselves, and their exposure to shame and anxiety makes them more susceptible to even become ill. It impacts every aspect of their being. And this is psychologically backed in a way. So in the developmental stage that middle schoolers and high schoolers are in, this quote says that young people of this age group undertake a process of self-examination in order to establish belief systems that will take them into adulthood and form a foundation for later exploration and introspection. As someone who grew up in the public school system, struggling with ADHD and some other learning difficulties, I can say from personal experience that shame is a real beast to conquer, especially when you're exposed to a lot of it in a classroom. Public shame especially can be really hard to work through. So this article strongly advocated and advocated for a holistic approach, and it stated that it is the responsibility of teachers to support in a holistic way the personal development of students who need to overcome their dyslexia. So it's not just fixing a disability. You can't fix a disability or fix a learning difference. It's talking about how can we develop these students as people and give them the tools to overcome their challenges. This article presented a lot of areas for further research. They talked about how dyslexia can impact the interaction with electronic means of communication. So they said that we need to research that further. They didn't discuss it in the article. But a lot of students rely heavily on email correspondence, online platforms, and that can present a whole other slew of challenges. So there's room for more research there. It did not take into consideration a lot of socioeconomic factors that could impact student-teacher relationships or the issue surrounding dyslexia. And it did not discuss the transition to what they call secondary school, or high school or college or adulthood. They briefly touched on having to sort through self-identity stuff, but they didn't specifically focus on that, and that could be an area for further research. And I added D, what to do in states that do not recognize dyslexia and other specific learning disabilities, and how to advocate for students in that way. I think it could be there could be a lot of research done in that area. So going back to the beginning, talking about actual content in that article, here's the definition, and it was put in the document called the Code when Northern Ireland recognized dyslexia as one of several specific learning difficulties. This definition is important to note because it specifically discusses the fact that dyslexia is not an all-encompassing learning disability that affects all aspects of a student's education. It impacts a lot of areas, but generally speaking, many students could excel in one area and their dyslexia could significantly impact their reading class, the most obvious, maybe the most obvious thing. And they also cites that many children become severely frustrated and have emotional and or behavioral difficulties as a result of this learning difference. The case study is Matthew from Northern Ireland, like I mentioned. This process was really specifically studied, focusing a lot on preserving Matthew's dignity through the entire process. So he was first consulted and given agency in the process of interviewing and consulting with a psychologist after he was finally flagged as needing some significant interventions due to some meltdowns that happened at school and at home. The school was, in its entirety, was asked to reflect and define its collective belief regarding dyslexia and how it might support students with dyslexia who were experiencing anxiety caused by failure. So Matthew had not been flagged previously for dyslexia. He was told that he had some difficulties with spelling, but years and years of internalized anxiety and failure, like even small little failures, kind of combined and combusted. And that's when this team was called to help Matthew. Many interventions were set in place, and I've listed a ton down here. The most interesting I found was that and impactful was that he was appointed a mentor as an advocate. So I'm assuming that because of his previous experiences in the classroom, there may be some conversations that were really difficult for Matthew to start himself. So this mentor would help him perfect some strategies for opening conversations, as well as go in and advocate for Matthew when he needed it. After the intervention, teachers reported that the strategies they had implemented for Matthew were actually of benefit to all learners, so all students ended up having a better education because of these intentional strategies that were put in place. So overall experience, there was empathetic awareness that created academic success for Matthew and his peers. The article gives some general guidelines for a holistic approach to dyslexia, working with students with dyslexia. And I took these points loosely from page 133, if you want to go back and check them out specifically. I tried to condense them. Primarily, it's important to protect a student's dignity. So instead of prescribing, we want to involve them in the intervention process and dedicate time to actively knowing the student in question. It's important to fully train and equip teachers to understand not only the accommodations, but the disability as well. It's important to ensure transparent, consistent, positive interactions between teachers and students across the entire school, publicly celebrating all levels of student success. And this is where remembering the survey is important. And across the board, students had a quite negative perception of teachers trying to deal with accommodations. A perception that included a lot of anxiety and shame. And perhaps most importantly, it's vital to have a strong partnership between schools, students, parents and guardians, and specialists. There are my citations down at the bottom. I'm happy to link this. I will link this in my discussion, this document in my discussion as well.